So good morning. It's an extreme pleasure for me to be here today. I would like to thank very warmly all the organizers. There is a long list of organizers, so I'm not going to cite all of them. If you understand well, you are most welcome if you want to organize the next conference at the European University Institute in Florence. The next one, or another one, I don't know, but you are most welcome. So today I'm going to talk about demographic change, international migration, and development. In academic debates on migration and development, usually demographers are called upon to set the stage for economists, and then economists tread the boards. And this is what will happen today. And after all, it's normal because migration and development interact through transfers of money, transfers of human capital, transfers of ideas through business networks, etc. And all these are not at all topics for demographers. It is nevertheless commonly admitted that population dynamics and structure are factors that have an impact on migration on one side and development on the other side. On migration first, it has been established, and I'm not going to repeat that today, that there is a very striking time coincidence between mass emigration and what we call the youth bulge that is occurring in the course of the demographic transition, when after after 2 or 3 decades of declining birth rates, you have shrinking basis of the age pyramid, and in relative terms, this bulge of young adults. Development studies, on the other side, usually consider that rapid or too rapid population growth just hampers economic growth. But when it comes to question how migration, and more precisely emigration, and development interact, then usually demography is put on one side. What I will try to do is to show that in addition to be contributing factors to both migration and development, demography can also be a kind of critical link between migration and development. Before presenting the core of my argument, I will set out some specific aspects of demography and the way demography can be linked to development, the demographic approach to development. So, development, I'm not going to talk about the concept. It's a concept that is shared by various disciplines, but what is clear is that the outcomes of development are specific to each discipline. And I will limit myself now to 3 or 4 remarks about demography and development. The first one is the relationship between development and growth, but more particularly between development and population growth. For economics, development mostly translates into growth. It is growth of income, growth of welfare, growth of many things, but it is always or almost always growth. While in demography, the relationship between development and growth is a kind of reverse U-shaped relationship between population growth and development. At an early stage of the demographic transition, when the transition was triggered by rising life expectancy at birth, then population growth was development in itself because it was reduced mortality. But at a later stage, rapid population growth started to be considered an obstacle to development. And the containment of growth through birth control was believed to bring development. Some demographers today have coined the expression of second demographic transition. Protracted below replacement fertility levels in industrialized or post-industrial countries would herald a second demographic transition that would be driven by secularism and women's agency and characterized by the disappearance of marriage, the instability of union, and delayed reproductive life. And once that transition is finished, a number of demographers, but I'm not part of them, believe that, again, population growth will start again, or at least population numbers will remain constant. The second point I want to highlight on demography and development is the particular, I would say, gender bias of demography. Demography is a biased discipline and pays attention almost only to women, not at all to men. And also, it's also part of the models of demography. Let me just quote the inventor of mathematical demography, Alfred Lotka. He was saying it will be helpful, at least for the moment, to treat our subject in its application to only one of the two sexes. For practical reasons, we choose the female population. And starting from the 1960s or 1970s, with the acceleration of growth rates, of population growth rates in the developing world, and the emergence of a population and development challenge, then demographers started to pay attention, I would say, almost only to women. The agenda of demographers came together with the agenda of family planning. Family planning was born, after all, as a social movement, and it became also a leitmotif for development agencies, in particular in the 1980s. Massive empirical evidence gathered by demographers through two worldwide surveys, the World Fertility Survey in the 1970s, early 1980s, and then the Demographic and Health Surveys, shows that transition from high to low crude death rates and total fertility rates that started to generalize in the second half of the 20th century, that transition is linked with women-related variables more than to any other sorts of variables. Women's education always comes as the first explaining factor in demographic change, always, without any exception to that. Then the age of women at first marriage comes. Then the employment of women outside the household. But male education, poverty reduction, urbanization, etc., do not bring any statistical explanation once controlled to the women-related variables I just mentioned. The fact that women are active agents of demographic change and not passive receivers of it has been demonstrated by the spread of birth control, in particular in the developing world. Worldwide survey data show that actual levels of fertility have little to do with the accessibility to contraceptive services when controlled by levels of wanted fertility, of desired fertility. The growing use of contraception in the world is a consequence of women wanting fewer children. It is not the cause of declining birth rates. So that is an important factor I wanted to mention. Another thing I want to mention is that in demography, and when you look at demographic change, there is one variable which is a key driver of any sort of change in demography, and that variable is knowledge, the progress of knowledge. First, the progress of scientific knowledge was a major driver of the increases in longevity, in human longevity. Then the popular access to knowledge through the dissemination of school education became a key driver of decreases in fertility. Educated women spend less time bearing and rearing children, and this gives them freedom to be employed outside the household, to participate not only in economic activities but in public debates and decisions, and to bring benefits for themselves as well as for the larger society. The next point I want to mention is that demographic change fits very well into Sen's notion of development as freedom. Declining birth rates and smaller families have completely, radically changed individuals' life for all mankind. Much has been said about the significance of the demographic transition at population level, but it's interesting to see its significance at individual level. Something like 100 years ago, the duration of life was 30 years, only 30 years. And an average woman would procreate between 6 and 9 children over her lifetime. It means that much of her life was spent bearing and rearing children. Today, in 2014, life expectancy at world level is 70 years, and the total fertility rate is 2.5 children. It means that the time dedicated to demographic reproduction has just shrunk, and new opportunities are offered, including opportunities for mobility and migration. So now I will come to the core of my argument, which is linking emigration, international migration, and demography into one single model. And I will do it in two parts. The first part corresponds to an article that was published years ago now, in 2006, as a World Bank paper on what I call the global benefit of international migration. And the second part, which is the lower panel here of this slide, is a more recent paper of 2011 that I have updated since then, which is on the shift from a family-oriented pattern of international migration to an individualistic pattern of international migration. That second paper was discussed by demographers, but to my knowledge, it was never discussed by economists. So I'm very happy to present it today. But first of all, I will start with the first aspect, which is the impact of migration on demographic change in developing countries. The common sense, if you ask what is the impact of moving one person from country A to country B, the common sense will answer that does not change at all the total number of individuals on Earth. And of course, this is true at any moment in time. But if we shift from the transversal to the longitudinal perspective, the common sense answer just breaks down. International migration does affect population reproduction over time. In that paper of 2006, I tried to show that modern migration may well have reduced population growth in the developing world, then contributing to containing rapid population growth at world level. The core argument is set in 3 points. The first point is that the largest flows of recent international migration are from south to north, meaning from high to low birth rates environment. The second point is that where they live, migrants are exposed to models that they will adopt for themselves and transfer to the society or the community left behind in the origin countries, and through a mechanism of ideational remittances. I prefer ideational remittances to social remittances, even though, of course, you will recognize the idea of Peggy-Levitt here. And the third point is that some of the models that are transferred have to do with patterns of family building, making migrants, international migrants, conveyors of demographic change in their society of origin, and more precisely, conveyor of change to non-migrant population of the origin society. The norms that have a bearing on demography are either directly linked to family building, and I'm talking of age at marriage, birth control, or they are indirectly linked, and I'm talking of the remote determinants of population change, in particular, as I said, the dissemination of school education. Just one bracket I open, and then I will close it. School enrollment has reduced the birth rates through two distinct mechanisms. One is because school enrollment raises the expected cost of any child and triggers a quantity for quality trade-off. And the other one, which is more important for what I'm going to develop, is girls' enrollment is a critical step in making women, in empowering women, in making women aspiring to more roles than only a role of wife and mother. My argument in that 2006 paper was tested, but not demonstrated, I have to say, in three countries of the Middle East and North Africa, in Egypt, Morocco, and Turkey. The migrants from North Africa and the Middle East have two destinations. One is the Gulf states, and the other one is, let us say, the West, but mainly Europe. Those migrants who go to the Gulf will find at destination societies that are more traditional than the society left behind in their origin country. They will find patriarchal values and practices that have been preserved, in particular by the political systems of these countries. I'm talking about the rentier state that was made possible by the oil rent in the Gulf. And actually, birth rates and fertility rates among nationals in the Gulf are much, much, much higher than what anyone would expect looking at their level of income. Migrants who go to the West, on the contrary, will find societies that have completed their demographic transition, where birth rates are lower than in migrants' origin countries, and with a higher status of women, in particular regarding the economic participation of women and their level of education. They will also find secularized societies. If the hypothesis of ideational remittances is true, then emigration will produce two opposite impacts. Emigration with the Gulf, to the Gulf, will translate into, if not elevating levels of fertility, at least stagnating levels of fertility in the origin country, while emigration to the West will translate into shrinking fertility in the origin country. And it is just what we observe. So I'm just going here here on this graph is on Morocco. I prefer to use that one, but let me start with this one. So here I'm trying to see how there is or there is no time coincidence between the birth rates on one side and not emigration, but the intensity of the link between migrants and their countries of origin. And the intensity of that link is proxied by remittances. And here in Morocco, we see a perfectly negative time correlation. Birth rates are declining while remittances are climbing. But you will say, okay, that is just normal. In many, many countries, it happens like that. Let me now show you that graph, which I think is much more interesting. In Egypt, the correlation is positive. Not only positive, but looking at the time series, they are incredibly parallel all the time. It means that each time more money comes to Egyptian households through remittances, fertility increases. And each time less money comes through remittances, fertility declines. And that is, my article of 2006 stopped somewhere in 2000. Now I had the time series to go until 2012. And it's absolutely amazing to see how the big increase in fertility that you observe in Egypt today, with more than 4 children per woman in 2012 in Egypt, is correlated, I will not say more than that, to increases in money coming through migrant workers' remittances. So the conclusions at that point seem to support the hypothesis of ideational remittances. Also, I'm not going to show you because that was in the first article. The time series were supported also by space correlation at district level in the 3 countries, Turkey, Morocco, and Egypt. I just show you the correlation here. Emigration, well, what is important is the midline, education and fertility. Education and fertility are always, whatever the country, in a negative correlation. The more education you have, the less fertility you have. But what is interesting is that immigration and fertility are positively correlated in Egypt, negatively in Morocco and Turkey, and that corresponds to correlation the other way around between immigration and education. So that was that first article, which I just wanted now to remind to you. I want here to make a remark, which I think is important, even though I don't know exactly what to do with that remark. But I think it's a notable feature when in migration studies usually, men are considered more important than women. And because men migrate more than women, and men send more remittances than women. But the relationship between migration, demography, and development operates entirely not only through women, but through non-migrant women. So I think it's something that I just wanted to highlight, even though I don't know what to do with it. But that, I will think of it in further research, I think. Again, I wanted to say is that since I published that article, it was supported or disputed by other papers. One paper I like very much was a paper by Bain, Dokier, and Schiff, supporting my argument with big data sets, so I was very happy with this. And then I read a paper on Turkey. That paper on Turkey was disputing the argument. The paper on Turkey was by White and Buckley, and that paper showed that in the origin communities in Turkey, women in household with a migrant did not at all differ in terms of fertility, marriage patterns, etc., from women in non-migrant households. So for the authors, it meant that transfers of norms are either inexistent or they are very small. On second thought, I don't think so. I think that it means, on the contrary, that in communities of origin, both migrants and non-migrants are exposed to the models, transfers through migration. So I was not convinced by that disputing article, which was good news for my ego at least. Then, a last point I want to show, even though it is not our topic of today, but it's a topic of other papers I've been publishing since then. that political developments that happened through the Arab region, starting from the very end of 2010, and which are, as you know, continuing today, provide perhaps an opportunity to test again this idea of ideational remittances, but looking at political remittances, and looking at, in particular, looking at democratic remittances or anti-democratic remittances. And very schematically, I thought, okay, again, let us look at the two possible destinations for migrants in the Middle East and North Africa. The Gulf on one side, where the state is authoritarian state, where there is no democracy, and the West on the other side. So migrants to the West will send democracy to their country of origin, while migrants to the Gulf will send authoritarian, anti-democratic values, etc., etc. And then I looked at correlation. Very, very unfortunately, I'm still working on Egypt because I had to rework the data. I have here not the data on Morocco, because in Morocco no big revolution happened, but the data on Tunisia. And I think they are quite interesting because they go apparently in the wrong direction. Here you have in Tunisia, you have a graph showing the votes at governorate level for two possible parties. On one side, the secular parties, on the other side, the Islamic party. And you have the proportion of immigrants. And clearly, the vote to secular parties is negatively linked with immigration, while the vote to Islamic party and Nahda is positively linked to immigration. So at first glance, that seemed to contradict the hypothesis of political remittances. Taking a second look at this, I'm not sure of it, because voting Islamists, voting for a Nahda party, was, if you realize that this party was banned under the ousted President Ben Ali, was very much commitment to democracy. So I'm not sure that it contradicts my hypothesis. Now, how long do I have? Jan, until when do I have? Okay, so I stop on this. I just wanted to say a few words, but I'm not very comfortable with this, to elaborate a bit more, to compare what's happening today in Egypt and Tunisia. Of course, the revolution is not at all the same today. In Egypt, it is return to authoritarian regime. In Tunisia, it is still the search for democracy. But I'm not going to put migration and the link with the Gulf on one side and the West on the other side into now, into the geography of Arab revolutions. So let me now move to the third part of my presentation, which is my second argument, the impact of demographic change in developing countries on migration from these countries. So how demographic change did impact immigration, which is looking at the other way around. It's very common, I think, to link migration and fertility. But the usual approach sees high immigration from developing countries as a response to low fertility in post-industrial countries. So it means that fertility at destination is just an exogenous factor for immigration from the origin country. Well, the idea which I will develop now is different from that one. It is looking at the relationship between fertility and immigration within the same country, and namely within the origin country of migrant, and looking at what impact fertility declines may have on immigration. Birth rates steadily decline in the developing world over recent decades, and declining birth rates are expected to relax pressures on labor markets, but that will happen with a delay of 20 to 25 years when smaller birth cohorts reach employment age. In the meantime, young adults will be subjected to rising demographic pressures that are linked with the competition for employment, competition for housing, competition also for symbolic recognition, etc., etc. The possible outcomes of this are of the exit or voice type. Growing numbers of competing and frustrated young adults will result in anything between migratory pressures and social and political protest. I'm not going to talk about the social and political protests, which I dealt with in other circumstances, but only on migration. And actually, it is widely acknowledged that the youth bulge, which is observed in the course of the demographic transition, is accompanied by an increase in immigration. What was not noticed, I think, and what I want to highlight now, is that there is another aspect of the demographic transition, which is that drops in fertility produce dramatic shift in the profiles of migrants. And this is a result of two trends. So again, I will return to Arab countries, even though I think that it could also work for other countries. The first trend is a remarkable delay in family building. Remarkable delay in family building that is observed over the last, here you have in light blue, the proportion of never married men at mean age of migration. I will return to that at 25 years in the Arab countries. So almost everyone was married in the 1960s, and almost no one is married today. So that is the trend number one. And this trend is accompanied also by birth control, but I'm not going now to show that because time is short. The second trend, which is much less noticed, is that one, is that the age patterns of international migration did not change almost for the last more than 60 years. And there is a remarkable age stability of age at international migration over time and space. And as far as we have statistics of international migration, the first international migration takes place at 25 years on average. So the result of these two trends combining with each other, on one side, delayed family building. On the other side, unchanged age pattern of migration. Then that will produce an outstanding shift in the individual situation of migrants, and also, as a consequence, in the motivation for migrating. I don't know if you can see that. So you have the red line is the pre-transition pattern of early family building and large families, and you go down to the green line, which is the end of transition pattern of late family building and small families. Until recently, and you have in white the age at migration, which is unchanged. Until recently, migrants had a family left behind, and migration was motivated by the need to feed that family and to educate children in the country of origin. Remitting money, remitting savings was the objective of migration. And remittances was the real cause, not the consequence, of migration. Migrants were altruistic. Today, it is not the same story, and tomorrow it will become even more so. Migrants are increasingly individuals, single individuals with no spouse and no children left behind in the origin country.
Their goal is more individualistic. They continue to remit money, if I look at the statistics of the World Bank, but if they remit savings, it is to prepare their own return or to manage a safety net for themselves. Remittances are becoming less necessary and perhaps also more oriented towards investments than consumptions. Also, but that is not the topic of our meeting today, that has a consequence for the destination countries, that family reunion policies will become less important in the future because there is no family left behind in the country of origin. At the same time, migrants and new migrants have a higher propensity to invest in knowledge and to accumulate human capital. We don't have good statistics on human capital, in particular if we want to have time series. So I'm just going to show you graphs. Don't ask me now, perhaps in the discussion if you want, on my methodology to construct these graphs. Let us just say that they start from this idea that all education is gained before 25 to 29 years of age. And then what we see when we compare the countries we have, here you have in blue the flows of human capital over the last half of a century, and in yellow the flows of remittances. In Egypt, you have the pre-transitional pattern, which is constantly dominated by remittances. In Morocco, you have a transitional pattern where both human capital and remittances are on the rise, while in Turkey, you have a post-transition pattern where human capital and flows of human capital are dominating the process. So this is what I wanted to show. Now in the 5 minutes that I have, I will try to draw some policy conclusions from all that. So I will try to draw one conclusion from each of my 2 parts on how to make the best of migration for development. The first conclusion starts from the point that migrants are not isolated individuals. They live in an environment, in the environment created by the whole society, and they share public and also sometimes private spaces with that host society. They are exposed to ideas of natives, which they will partly make their own and then partly also transmit to communities left behind in the origin countries. Some ideas are related to the condition of women, in particular the education of women or economic participation of women. And these are crucial drivers of demographic change, which is linked to development. The main point here, I think, is that the better migrants are integrated in the whole society, the more powerful these mechanisms of ideational remittances are. And integrating migrants in the destination country is kind of a condition of successful impact of migration on development of the origin countries. And here there is a strong, I think, policy recommendations for the destination countries, that they should really, if they want to make migration a factor of successful development in the origin country, they need to make a link between integration policies or policies for integrating migrants and aid to development policies. I think that is something important. My second conclusion is linked with the second part of my presentation, that migrants are not only motivated by altruistic goals, but increasingly by individualistic goals. There is a shift from migrants with a family left behind to migrants with no family left behind, to single individuals. The objective that was feeding a family left behind is now receding, and the main objective will become self-achievement of migrants. Remittances were rightly and are still rightly regarded in particular by the World Bank as a major source of income that can be mobilized for development. And a few years ago, or let us say perhaps 6 or 7 years ago, a slogan of the World Bank was creating a climate favorable to flows of investment, if I'm right, or it was something like that. Fostering development through knowledge, through ideational remittances should become a priority matter now on development agendas. And I would like to propose that the timely slogan could be creating a climate favorable to flows of ideas, and not only to flows of investment. And I think it is a greater challenge, because states always welcome money, they welcome investment, but are they ready to open their doors to new ideas? I'm not sure. And this is what I'm trying to observe in the Arab countries today. So thank you very much for listening to me.